this is a question for Simon. So in the Landsat data, whenever you were talking about doing stream sets, do you ever use the temporal factors of Landsat data to look at locations that you want to actually do the stream sampling? So for example, if I were to use data from a month ago, take it back to the last big rainy season, look at that through time and see the movement of sediments. Do you ever use that for location identification?
No, I tend to use my first go-to data sets, probably Bing Maps or Google Earth, because it's high resolution, or purchase the high resolution. The next one after that then is using the elevation models to make sure we're back off the floodplains, etc. Radiometrics is also an indication if you're using a ternary radiometrics. Quite often if you're in the floodplain, you can see it all suddenly. It's the alluvium tends to come through as white or yellow, so it's high in all three, so use that one. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? It's not ritual humiliation to come up here, I mean, you can actually ask your question back there. They have to stand up here.
James here, Augur, one of your sponsors. 2 questions. What value do you put on the historics? Many geologists will look at the historic geochemical data versus what we can collect now. And the second question is, whenever we would sample on 99.9% of our projects, everybody is asking us to do hydrochloric testing, dripping on the soils, so we can get a reactive soil to get away from that weather profile. Is that something that you'd consider as well?
I can answer the historic question. It's very much date and area dependent, I find. So I've seen some historic data which is very good, and I guess we're talking 90s, 2000s. Very good. You still always have to be very careful with your QA/QC. There's been times when I've used data from the geological surveys where you do have to spend a significant amount of time cleaning that data before you use that. But then the coverage can be good. It tends to be quite consistent after the 1990s, 2000 in terms of method, which is really good. Earlier than that, you tend to find that there's only a few elements analysed for, which can be very problematic. So I think there is definitely value in some of this historical data. But as I said, you do have to look for batch effects. You do have to take that time to clean it and interpret it before you do anything with it. And there will be data you end up pretty much throwing out before you start your interpretation.
Didn't address the fizz test as well. So I agree a lot with what Fiona said. I would say with historic data, I think we're seeing that I wouldn't discount a lot of stuff that's below detection. That's probably the biggest mistake. That if you've still got anomalous samples out there, that's great. But there's a lot of background stuff that gets overlooked now with modern detection, and there's a lot of examples where people have reprocessed old samples. And with the fizz test, I'd probably be more inclined to incorporate the fizz test and use that as a parameter in your assessment. I mean, we've got some great examples depending on where you are. Calcrete sampling and things like that's been very effective. So again, I guess it depends what you're targeting, but I'd be more inclined to just keep that as a parameter, and you can assess it against your calcium, magnesium concentrations later on, and use that in your understanding rather than just trying to avoid it outright. But horses for courses, I guess.
So just a question about the Sentinel-2 data that you were talking about. I'm not really familiar with it, but is that a preference over the ASTER data sets, or is that completely different data that you're using in that analysis?
Yeah, it's different to the ASTER in terms of it doesn't have as many bands out into the SWIR. The great advantage of the ASTER is being out there in the shortwave infrared. But these days, personally, I wouldn't use the ASTER. I go to WorldView 3, which then will give you 7.5 megapixels as opposed to 30 or 60 megapixels with ASTER. ASTER was only ever experimental. It's gone through lots of different processing parameters to update it, and it's always recommended if you do use ASTER to always download the latest version where it's been run through iteration number 40 something or so that they're on now in terms of reprocessing it. Yeah.
Thank you.
But definitely Sentinel over Landsat, because you got 9 pixels for every one that you have in Landsat.
Fiona, any idea how can you assess the fertility of ultramafic units? Like one thing is to find ultramafics, but then not all ultramafics are related to ore. Is there any pathfinder that you came across as useful?
Nickel's a really tricky one because we're talking magmatic nickel, because you don't tend to get that dispersion that you see in other deposits. So it is notoriously difficult in that way. One thing you can do, and I do when I'm looking for nickel, is you have to be very careful, as you probably know, with your nickel concentrations themselves, because you get a lot of that silicate nickel. So one way I commonly look, especially when I'm looking at rocks or rock samples, is to plot your nickel versus your magnesium or your chrome. And basically you'll get a line that represents your silicate, nickel and olivine, and then start looking for anything that plots just above that value. In terms of pathfinders, it's really difficult. I'm going to do a talk last thing of the day today on soil sampling looking for nickel, and the only elements I could really use in the soils there, other than to map my ultramafics themselves, as you were saying, but the only all commodity elements I could use there was pretty much nickel, cobalt, copper, and even my platinum. My platinum elements were really below detection limits, so they weren't very good. But if you've got good detection limits and try and get good detection limits, then your PGs and your gold. But other than that, it's really difficult.
Thanks for that.
Okay, well then, sorry about that. I would like to thank the speakers for the first session this morning, and now it's morning tea, and we would like you back in your seats by 5 to 11. Thank you very much.